Hey guys, it's Will. It's Hong Kong Cinema Appreciation Society. Welcome back to the channel. Welcome back to the laundry room. Hell yeah, you know you love it. If you are new to the channel, if you feel like subscribing, give us a comment, give us a thumbs up, all that fun stuff. It would be much appreciated. I do thank you so much if you do decide to do that. Also, check us out on Patreon. You can give $2, you can give $5. I do exclusive reviews in there. I do early releases. I do little polls. I do screenshots of movies I've been watching and stuff like that. It's a fun little community, and huge shout out to all our patrons, because that money really is a huge boon to this channel. If you look in the description of this video below, you'll be able to see a link to the Patreon. Let's get right into it. What are we here to talk about today? Hell to the yes! It's the Shaolin plot. This is a Eureka release. This is a Region B release. And this is Sammo Hung. This is Chen Xing. This is Casanova Wong. This is a 1977 Golden Harvest old school martial arts movie. The kind of theme of this release, if there is one, is that this film is a lost masterpiece. It's an underappreciated film. It deserves to be seen much more. And Eureka even is... I have the... I know people like seeing this sometimes. Eureka was nice enough to send me the press release here. And so Eureka is really kind of pitching this. This is a... So what it says right here, let me read this to you. 2K restoration of one of the best and most important works of martial arts cinema. So most important, I would argue that they are saying that because this is really the movie that was like Sammo Hung's last step before becoming the Sammo Hung we know him as now. 1977, right, was the year before like his big kind of breakout movies of like Warriors 2, right? And Prodigal Son was around that time. Then he made Knockabout, and he really became this huge star as a producer, as a writer, as a director, as an actor. And this was kind of that last stepping stone before that. It's also, a lot of people I think would argue, based on what I'm seeing with the director Huang Feng, I'm not super familiar with his work, I have to say, but from what people are saying in the commentary tracks here, the essay and stuff like that, this is maybe his best movie. And so for his career as a whole, this is a movie that should be kind of more well appreciated and more well known. I enjoyed the crap out of this movie. I had never seen this film before. I really liked it. It's got really fun fighting in it. It's an unusually thoughtful film in terms of the way it's written and presented. I will talk about that later in this review. I'm just giving you kind of very basic thoughts right now. And so if you don't know this about me, my undergraduate degree is in art history, and with a minor in Japanese. And I studied, essentially what I studied was East Asian kind of art. And I lived in Japan. And when I lived in Japan, I studied Chinese and Japanese art. And I studied architecture as well. I studied Buddhism, and I studied Buddhist architecture. And there are incredible shots of this Buddhist temple in Korea where they shot this. They shot it at like pretending they faked it as the Shaolin temple, basically. This temple is like mind-blowingly incredible. And there are so many beautiful, amazing shots of this temple that honestly, it's like architecture porn for me. Like I could just watch this movie to see the shots of that temple. Like it is there. I like paused certain parts of it. I rewound it to watch it again. I said the same thing about Spiritual Kung Fu with the temple in that movie. Now, what I think is funny is, if you know Food for Thought, the podcast, Sean from Food for Thought, I saw his review of this movie on Letterboxd, and he's like, I spent a lot of this movie waiting for the shots of the temple to end so I could watch the fighting. And I was like, it's the exact opposite for me. I'm like, can you stop fighting for a minute so I can see the temple better? It's just funny because people watch movies for different reasons, right? And Sean is like a huge fan of the fight scenes and the shapes and stuff like that. And I'm really kind of, one of the things I love the most about cinema is it is a medium that it captures things as they are in a certain place and time. And just the visual aspect of it and the way that film preserves that so well as a medium, celluloid and whatever. And how like this remaster looks it looks incredible. Like this is another one where I said out loud to myself, like, holy shit, just like when I first put it on, like it looks, just the Golden Harvest logo is so clean. So I will geek out more about this movie later in this review, but suffice it to say, if you like old school martial arts movies, if you like architecture, if you like Buddhist temple architecture, if you like Shaolin movies, if you like Wu-Tang movies, if you like Sammo Hung, if you like these kind of outlandish old school martial arts movies with these really evil villains and stuff like that, you will really enjoy the crap out of this movie. It's, as I've said before, for me, these old school martial arts movies are really comfort food, and this is like in that top class of like, I don't know what your favorite comfort food is, but I love like Oreos. And I love I'm such a fat pig. And I like ice cream and stuff like that. This would be like an Oreo type of movie for me. Like this is like the first thing I'm reaching for when I'm like, I've had a really crappy day and I need to shove some food into my fat face. This is like the movie equivalent of that. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what this movie's about. I'm going to show off the physical release. I'll talk about the bonus features on here. I'll give you a little bit of my thoughts, and then I'll be out of your hair. The plot of this movie is really simple. So basically, you have this evil prince who reports directly to the emperor, and he has invited the 4 major martial arts schools over to his house, his mansion, whatever it is. And what he wants their martial arts manuals, because he wants to learn all of the martial arts techniques so that he can become like the ultimate indestructible fighter, right? But then, of course, the schools are like, yeah, right, dude. They don't even show up, right, at his house because they know what he's up to. And so he kind of has to go out into the world and try to steal these martial arts manuals or try to, and so like the big action of the movie, there's kind of two different parallel plot strains. One is about the James Tien character, who Frank Jen calls him James Teen, which I would imagine Frank knows how to pronounce it, right? Because it's his native language. So James Teen, or James Tien, not James Tien, but James Teen, I think is how Frank was saying it. He is like the son of the head of the Wu-Tang school. And so one of the plots is about him escaping this evil prince's forces who come to destroy their school and steal their manuals, and they're kind of after him, and he befriends this like exiled Shaolin monk and kind of he becomes his pupil. That's kind of one plot strain, and then he wants to get revenge on them for, destroying his school, killing his father and stuff like that. And then you have the evil prince trying to get the Shaolin temple manuals because they are protected in the center of the temple in a special building surrounded by monks. So there's like two kind of plot threads going on at the same time that eventually come together at the climax of the film. That's the movie in a nutshell. So to show off, we have the limited to 2000 first pressing here, which you get this slipcase here. I actually really like this artwork. I know that some of these Eureka slipcases are kind of like controversial in the fan community, but I really like the artwork for this film. I also really like that you can reverse the inside, because check this out. That is an awesome poster. I just like these big red letters, the lines to create this triangle here. I've talked before when I analyzed my favorite Kung Fu Bob artwork for the Blu-ray releases. You see a lot of triangles in artwork, right? Like Star Wars is a classic example of that, kind of the pyramid of characters on the original Star Wars poster. You see that on the Stranger Things posters, which are obviously very inspired by the Star Wars posters, because it draws your eye in, because it has obvious lines, right? And so it's a very clear, obvious shape. Like Kurosawa used a lot of triangles in the way that he would block scenes and stuff like that. So you get very clear, right? You've literally got the lines of a triangle going through this poster here. But I really love this artwork and this image. I'm really happy that Eureka gave you the option to flip that over like that. And that's the back cover there. And then you pop it open, and here you have the disc, and here you have the booklet. The booklet has an essay from James Oliver, which I really enjoyed, as I always enjoy James Oliver's writing. So James Oliver talks about how he feels this is a lost masterpiece, which Frank Cheng says the same thing. Michael Wirth says the same thing. Like I said, it's really kind of the thesis of this release, that this is a lost masterpiece. He talks about so I found this really fascinating, that James Oliver talks about the importance of Huang Feng, who is the director of this film, as a mentor to Sammo Hung, and how that influence on Sammo seems to be kind of lost in people's narrative of Sammo's career, and that he thinks that it's kind of something that we should give more consideration to. So I thought that was really interesting, because again, like I said, I really don't know that much about Huang Feng as a filmmaker. And I'm pretty sure this is the first movie of his I've seen. So it was really cool to kind of see that perspective. He also talks about, which I think is really interesting in this film, and this is something that I also saw a lot of in Shaolin Wooden Men, which is another movie that I loved and thought was super underrated, which is, Jackie Chan movie from the 70s, which is the tension between the philosophy of like peace and harmony and non-violence and that kind of stuff that you see in like the Buddhism of the Shaolin monks and other philosophies of the martial arts, and how that is directly at odds with the application of the martial arts as violence, essentially, right? And like, and also the violence of these films. And he gives like a really interesting little breakdown of how that the tension between those things manifests itself in this film. He also analyzes story, character, kind of stuff like that, which in a way that I thought was pretty interesting. So then you get 2 commentary tracks. Those are the bonus material on here. And you get one with Frank Zhang and Michael Wirth. I've talked about the 2 of them before. I love hearing the 2 of them together. Frank Zhang, obviously, is from Hong Kong and worked in the industry for years. And he has seen so many of these films as such an encyclopedic knowledge, but also, you know, speaks the language, is from the culture, and is just this indispensable resource. Does so much research too. Actually, at one point, Michael Wirth says, like, I can't believe how much research you've done on this. And Frank was like, well, you know, I am a librarian. So, which is true. Frank is a librarian by trade. So I thought that was a funny little quote, but also a great little insight into what, you know, Frank's process of, like, you literally have a librarian doing research into these films for you who can speak a language that I would imagine a lot of people who watch this channel do not. I don't speak Cantonese, and I cannot read written Chinese, right? So Frank is like such an indispensable resource. And then Michael Wirth, you know, as a filmmaker, he's a martial artist, who's someone who's been in these films. He actually talks about, one of the things I loved about this commentary track is that they talk about meeting Sammo. They've both spent time with Sammo, and Frank hung out with him when he was, Sammo was getting like an honorary award, I think from, it was maybe the New York Asian Film Festival. Someone was giving Sammo an honorary award. And they asked Frank to like be Sammo's kind of interpreter guy, like hang out with him. And he talks about spending like a couple days with Sammo. And if I'm not mistaken, Sammo is Frank's personal favorite fight choreographer. So, you know, he like geeks out about like spending time with Sammo. And then Michael Wirth auditioned for Martial Law, you know, which was Sammo's show in the US, which I think it was a Walker, Texas Ranger spinoff. And so they talk about like their stories with Sammo and stuff like that, which is just really cool to hear them talk about. Frank says at the top of the commentary track, this is the Shaolin Kung Fu classic you've probably never heard of, right? So again, everyone's calling this movie a classic, and I'm not going to disagree with them. So they talk about the director is in the film, which I never would have known. They talk about which part he plays. There's a really thoughtful analysis of the King Hu influence on this film that continues throughout the whole movie. Like at the end of the movie, they're talking about like, oh, that's a music cue from Touch of Zen. And like that shot there is very clearly influenced by this, but this plot device is very clearly influenced by Raining in the Mountain. And, you know, Sammo Hung worked with King Hu. And so they talk about how, you know, Sammo's part in this movie. Frank actually says something really funny. He says Sammo's basically playing a Bond villain in this movie. I would argue, not to say that Frank is wrong, but he's playing like a Bond henchman in my mind. Like if the main bad guy, Chen Sing plays the main bad guy, like if he is Goldfinger, then, you know, Sammo's playing like Odd Job, like that kind of role, right? But you know, Sammo played a kind of a similar role, I believe, in one of the King Hu films. And so they talk about that, and it's a really interesting, you know, to learn about that. And Michael Wirth talks about how this director is really great with exterior shooting and like really beautiful. And as I said, I geeked out about the temple shots and stuff, like shots of the forest around the temple, really, really beautiful stuff. There is a weapon in this movie that is basically a flying guillotine. Michael Wirth talks about the history of flying guillotines going back to the 1940s. I had no idea that. I kind of just think of like, you know, Flying Guillotine 2, Master of the Flying Guillotine. Like, I didn't know they were making Flying Guillotine movies like in the 40s. And like, that's this like there's this whole tradition of these weapons in these films. So that was like super cool. Rosamund Kwan's dad is in this movie. What? I had no idea. And he's like a big movie star. He's like definitely before my time. Like, you know, the 70s martial arts movies are really like, you know, my love of Jackie and Hong Kong cinema in general started in the 90s. Then I went back into the 80s. Now that I'm running this channel, I'm getting heavily back into the 70s. Like, I had previously seen, like, Shaw Brothers films from the 70s, but I wasn't super familiar with, like, the Golden Harvest 70s stuff and those types of things. So I'm getting, you know, further, obviously, other than Bruce Lee, who I'd seen all those films. But I'm learning a lot more about the 70s movies now. So, like, stuff going back into the 40s. And, like, Rosamund Kwan's dad was acting in, like, the 50s and stuff like that. Like, I know basically nothing about Hong Kong cinema in that era. So it was super cool to learn all about him in this. And then Frank Jang points out how the dialogue in some of the scenes is very novelistic, and which I thought was pretty interesting to hear his take on that. They talk about Raymond Chow and how he really trusted talent. He thought they were undervalued at Shaw Brothers. Like, he was willing to pay more to trust them to make better films. So how, like, people started leaving, how Raymond Chow himself left Shaw and why other people started following him and stuff like that is really interesting little combo there. And and one other thing I'll say, so Michael Wirth, actually, I thought this was really interesting. He talks about the average shot length in this era in martial arts filmmaking, which is like such a specific thing. Of course, he would know about that, right? And then Frank, so this is, like I said, this is a Korean temple. This is one of the 3 major temples in Korea. So Frank talks about where this temple is, why it exists, what the other 2 major temples are, where they are, where they exist, what they each represent. It's like really, really cool. If you like me are a geek for Buddhist temple, it's such a hyper specific thing to be a geek about. But I have like a whole book about Japanese Buddhist temple architecture. It's like a big I used to work at an art museum, and I got this big like coffee table art book about like Japanese Buddhist temple architecture. Like, I like geek out about it so much. I love it. And these Korean temples that are in these Hong Kong movies, like I said, with Shaolin Wooden Men as well, and Spiritual Kung Fu, like, they're just amazing looking. So anyway, and again, there are sets in these films, but the way they balance the sets and the location shooting, I think, is done really, really well. So then the Mike and Arna commentary. So one of the things I thought was fascinating about this is that Arna does an ongoing analysis of this film, comparing it to Star Wars. It came out in the same year as Star Wars. And at first I just thought it was like a funny bit that he was doing, but it's not. And I don't mean that in a bad way. Like, throughout the whole movie, he's like, let's stop here and talk about how this is really similar to Star Wars. And it's like really fascinating. And like with Shaolin Wooden Men, right, I noticed a big Star Wars parallel with that film. With this, I never would have noticed that. And Arna goes into like really great detail about the Star Wars comparison. It's really interesting. They talk about Sammo and his Star Wars connections and his relationships to other people. Like in the films, like Mang Hoi is in this film and Yoon Bi-yoo is in this film. I think Yoon Wah might be like one of the background characters and stuff like that. So they point those guys out and they talk about their relationships to Sammo and their personalities and stuff like that. Arna talks about how he almost met Sammo Hung one time, but didn't quite. But Mike knows Sammo, I think, pretty well. They talk about this film in the kind of the history of the films and relationship, especially to Jackie's, big action comedies that came out just a year after this was released. The white eyebrows. I thought this was really interesting. That like there's a tradition in these kung fu movies of these guys to have these huge bushy white eyebrows. They talk about like the history of that, the symbolism of it and stuff like that. It was really interesting. They talk about Golden Harvest's in-house editor who edited this movie, who edited like so many classic movies that it's almost overwhelming to think about. Obviously, he would have as the in-house editor at Golden Harvest. They talk about the screenwriter of this film too, who wrote like hundreds of novels, hundreds of screenplays. Like, it's just his credits are just ridiculous and incredible, and it was really interesting to hear them. That's at the top of the commentary track, so like really kind of in the first scene they talk about that. And I would highly recommend, if you're not the kind of person who wants to sit through an hour and 50 minutes, like I watched this movie 3.5 times like in the past 2 or 3 days, because I watched the movie, I watched the 2 commentary tracks, and I went back and watched some of the scenes again that I wanted to check out. But if you're not the kind of person who wants to watch, like 6 hours worth of stuff to get through all the stuff in the commentary track, I would highly recommend just throwing on the top part of like the beginning of the commentary track, because there's really cool stuff in there about the screenwriter. And and so one other thing I'll mention about their commentary track that I thought was really fascinating. At the end of this film, there's a scene where James Teen fights like all of these Shaolin monks. And Arna's like, if you look at the monks in the background, they're sunburned as shit. Like, they're not wearing shirts, right? He's like, so they probably shot this at the end of the day. And if you watch the way that the fighting is choreographed, you'll see that the actors are being thrown out of the frame. So probably what they're doing is they have crash pads all over the place, because these guys are not wearing shirts, so they're not wearing padding, and they don't want to be landing on the hard-ass concrete surface of the temple with no shirt on. So they're putting pads down, and the film is edited in such a way that you don't see the falls, which I didn't notice, but you see the people being thrown, but you don't see the landing because they're putting crash pads like at it. And they should point out like where there are trampolines in the choreography in that scene. But once they talked about the sunburn, I started noticing that James Teen is like sweating balls in that scene. And I'm like, it must have been so freaking hot in Korea, probably shooting in the summer, like standing out there all day with the humidity and the sun in this open space of this temple. And then that to me really triggers like thinking about what it's like to be there on the day and be making these films and stuff like that. So that I really enjoyed that conversation between the two of them as part of their commentary track. So I have two thoughts that I want to give on this film, and then I will be out of your hair. Because again, this was my first viewing, so I did want to talk about it a little bit. So one of them is just, I just wrote in capital letters, I love the architecture. I just love it. Like, I love the look of this film. I love the locations, and I just think it does an incredible job of capturing, and it also has this kind of, it does a great job of preserving these spaces and stuff like that. And it has, as James Oliver talks about in his essay, it does have this interesting focus on the philosophy of peace and pacifism and nonviolence versus the necessity to violence that is precipitated by the events in films like this and the tension between those things. But it also, this movie does have really fun, outlandish, ridiculous violence in it, like decapitations and like blood spurting and like that kind of stuff, and like severe beatings. And like Casanova Wong is in this movie. Casanova Wong goes apeshit at the end of this movie with the kicks. Dude, his kicks are insane. This is some of the craziest kicking I've ever seen. He just unleashes this fusillade of like machine gun kicks, and it's just like, I just went like, yes, sitting watching the movie on my couch, because I'm like, what? Why does he do that? It doesn't even seem human. So like, there's a lot to enjoy about the pacing and the storytelling and the philosophy of this film, but it's also just like a really fun martial arts movie. So the one other thing I wanted to mention was, everyone who comments on this film talks about how it's a little bit longer than these movies usually were. It's not 90 minutes like a lot of these films are. It's 110 minutes. It's almost 2 hours long. That's long for an old school martial arts movie. And one of the reasons it's long is that the scenes take a long time to build, not in a bad way. And Michael Wirth actually talks about how the director really trusts silence. Jimmy Wang Yu does this too. I've talked about this with relation to the Chinese boxers. This is a very Japanese thing, to use silence to build tension within scenes. And the Huang Feng is not doing quite the same thing here. He's not using silence the way that Japanese filmmakers would use silence, the way that Jimmy Wang Yu, as influenced by the Japanese, is using silence. He's using silence to kind of build ambiance, and which again, that, you know, to talk about the King Hu influence is a very King Hu thing, to build ambiance through silence, through the beauty of imagery, through pacing and stuff like that, right? But one thing that I thought was really fascinating about this film is that this movie has sequences in a very Western way. When I say sequences, I mean a very, very specific thing. So if you're unaware of the terminology of screenwriting, essentially a sequence is a chunk of a movie in which there is a goal that is oriented towards the overall goal of a film. So a perfectly structured, academically, like perfect, classic Western film script would usually have 6 to 8 sequences. You would have a single overall goal, and each sequence would be a step towards achieving that goal. And the protagonist would either achieve or not achieve their goal in that sequence, and then they would move on to their next attempt to achieve the overall goal through another small goal. Right? So to give you a practical example of this, a movie that a lot of people will point to as being like really tremendous from like an academic standpoint is Lethal Weapon, which is actually a movie that I also love, right? So the overall goal of Lethal Weapon is to solve the murder mystery, right? So, you know, a sequence in that film would be when they go up to that house, that it's in the Hollywood Hills, and that, you know, they've gotten an address and they're going to go and they're going to investigate it. And then you have the twist of the guy attacks them, so they have to shoot back. And so they actually do, I'm going to spoil a little bit of Lethal Weapon for you. I'm sorry. They end up murdering this guy, right? So they get a clue, this guy can help you. They go up there, that guy attacks them, they shoot him, so they don't achieve their goals. That sequence is a failure, right? So they have to go on to the next piece of the mystery to try to solve the puzzle. So each of these things is a sequence. So in Shaolin plot, to give you one example of this, The James teen character is given the manuals to Shaolin by his dad. And his dad's like, just run away because these people are going to kill us. And he runs away and he is pursued by the bad guys. Then he meets this Shaolin monk who says he'll protect him. And then the Shaolin monk has a fight with some of these guys. And then the Sammo Hung character shows up as like a bigger badass. There's conversation and fighting with him. It escalates, it de-escalates. There's all these moments of rising tension. And it really is a sequence in the classic sense of James Teen, if I'm saying that correctly, is trying to escape and protect his family's martial arts manuals and the secrets of their school and the traditions of their school. He is being pursued. He gets stopped. The plot twist is there's a Shaolin monk there who's going to protect him. Then another plot twist is the Sammo Hung character shows up. Like this is a genuine sequence in the sense of a very specific Western storytelling screenwriting thing that you don't always see a ton of in non-Western films. You do see it in like people like Kurosawa are so unbelievably influential upon Western filmmaking, right? Like not just with Hollywood, like, you know, Kurosawa was a huge influence on Lucas and Coppola and people like that, but also he was an influence on Sergio Leone, and Sergio Leone was working in kind of more mainstream Western style genres where you would have more traditional sequences, right? Not necessarily in like the 80s, 90s sense of the word, but like you could probably look at a film like Fistful of Dollars and then again, Yojimbo, right? Because Kurosawa was really influenced by film noir and by John Ford and like old Westerns and shit like that, right? And like sequences as a concept goes way back to, I'm sorry if you don't give a flying shit about the history of sequences in Hollywood and screenwriting and stuff like that, but sequences are rooted in a film reel being 10 minutes long, and screenwriters way back in the day, like in the 30s and 40s or whatever, they would write chunks of screenplays for a reel of film so that it could all be shot. Like, let's say they were going to shoot it like a film noir, and you could have a whole scene. Like if you think about Maltese Falcon, right? You're in Sam's office for like a number of scenes in that film. You could write, you know, an 8 to 10 page sequence that all takes place inside that office. And then you could just film it all with a reel of film, right? And so that's kind of like where the thinking for sequences came from. So like films like the John Ford films, you could see sequencing in there being influential on Kurosawa, and that in turn coming back to influence, you know, other Western films. But the point being, with regard to Hong Kong cinema, you don't really see those styles of sequences in these movies until decades later, maybe a little bit in the 90s and the late 80s, when people like Jackie Chan are very deliberately looking at Hollywood movies. You know, Jackie Chan talks about with Operation Condor, Armor of God, how he was trying to make a Steven Spielberg movie, right? So when you're getting into that territory, yeah, you're starting to carry that influence over from American filmmaking. But at this era in the 70s, you don't see a lot of that. So that was really, really interesting, that level of kind of investment and the thoughtfulness of the screenwriting. And like, instead of just taking a plot and throwing a bunch of fighting scenes around it and having some characters, there's this really interesting sense of the rise and fall of tension and action within extended sequences. So I just thought that was really interesting as a writer and as someone who studies these types of things. So the movie is Shaolin Plot. It's a really, really great, entertaining, old school martial arts movie. I highly recommend it. You get to see Sammo in this outlandish with these mutton chops, with the bald head, with the mustache. There's great fighting in this film. There's really thoughtful filmmaking, really incredible locations. It's another just like fantastic release from Eureka, who just does such amazing work. I'm always so impressed and pleased with their releases. I'm Will. It's Hong Kong Cinema Appreciation Society. As always, I thank you so much for watching, and we will see you next time.